All right, welcome everyone. My name is Wes Cisco. I am currently a postdoctoral fellow here at University of Cologne and the Concept Research Center. Today we're going to have a roundtable discussion of Alessandra Tanesini's book, Mismeasure of the Self. Now, this is part of our ongoing Philosophers Meets Critics series. So if you look at our other YouTube videos, you can also see other recent books along with commentators on those books. So we're going to be hearing from Dr. Tanesini first, and then we're going to hear from 4 different commentators. At the end, we'll have a chance to have a roundtable discussion to get some feedback on the book and discuss some ongoing issues. First up, we have Dr. Alessandra Tanesini. She's going to present on her book, Mismeasure of the Self.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. And thank you for the commentators for having read the book and be willing to comment on it. So here is the cover of the book, which shows Alice being the wrong size for the little doll. Right, so let me just say something about the structure of the book and what I tried to achieve with it. So the book can be thought as having 4 parts. In part 1, I try to say what I think intellectual virtues and vices are, and I try to provide a novel, I think, psychological framework for understanding the underpinnings of these virtues and vices. The central part of the book is dedicated to a cluster of virtues and vices. The virtues are acceptance of limitations and modesty about intellectual achievements, which I think together make up the complex virtue of intellectual humility. And then all the vices that I call vices of superiority and vices of inferiority that are opposed to these virtues. Then the third part of the book talks about the moral and epistemic harms that are caused by the vices of inferiority and superiority, both to the person who has the vices, to other epistemic agents, and to the community at large. And I also talk about whether it makes sense to think that people have responsibility for their vices. And the final part of the book is very short and is the final chapter, and is just a proposal on how to remedy the harm done by these vices. In this presentation, I will briefly really talk only about part A, B, and C. I will say nothing about the proposal for remedy. I do not know whether anybody in the comments has focused on that. If they have, then I can talk to it in the discussion. So in part 1, really, I think primarily aim to make just 2 or 3 points. Point number 1 is that there is much more heterogeneity, I think, to virtue and vices than is normally thought. I mean, I should say Kasim-Kassan also thinks vices are heterogeneous. And when I say heterogeneous, I mean that there are different kinds of psychological beasts. And I am assuming here virtues and vices have empirical reality. They are not just philosophical fictions. And so what I think is that they are not natural kinds, natural psychological kinds. They are underpinned by structures that have something in common, in my view, attitudes, but also many, many differences. And so I talked about at least 3 kinds of virtues and vices: sensibilities. So an example of an intellectual sensibility that is a virtue is being observant. An example of one that would be a vice would be being inobservant, and a moral epistemic vicious sensibility could be what Jose Medina, for instance, has defined as racial insensitivity or numbness. The second variety are thinking styles. An example of a thinking style, which I think is neither a virtue nor a vice, is playing devil's advocate all the time. And I think some thinking styles, which are habits of thinking, can be virtues. I think having open-mindedness as a thinking style is a virtue. Being bigoted and prejudiced as a thinking style is vicious. And then there are character traits. And so I think of intellectual humility as an example of a virtue and arrogance as an example of a vice. So that's the first point. There is heterogeneity they are not all of the same kind. The second point that I know people are going to pick up on is that, at least for character trait, virtue and vices, I think that they have a motivational component, and that actually the motivational component defines what kind of virtue or vice it is. The motivational component of intellectual virtues, or at least the ultimate motivation of intellectual virtues, is a love for epistemic goods, or for the truth, or contact to reality, whatever you want to call it. This idea is already there in Linda Zetsky virtue of the mind. But I suppose what defines my view is that I am one of the lonely voices that thinks that actually bad epistemic motivations are essential to epistemic vices. On the other hand, and contrary to many of the people here, I do not think that bad effects are essential to vices, or good effects are essential to virtue. So I do not take that virtue is essentially reliable and that vices are essentially unreliable. Having said that, I do believe that in ordinary circumstances, we would expect virtues typically to foster setting the right epistemic goals and achieving them, and vice typically to hinder doing so. But there could be odd circumstances of extremely lucky or unlucky environments where the person who has the correct motivations nevertheless fails to be reliable. So this makes my account an internalist account in many ways. And I know that this is one of the features of the account that others here are going to take issue with. The second part of part one that I think is important, but I'll be brief because I don't know that anybody here has really picked up on it as something they want to focus on, is that I think I supply a novel psychological framework. I rely on the notion of attitude, not as philosophers understand it, so not as propositional attitude, but as an associative state, which is a summary evaluation of an object. So attitudes, so understood, are cognitive shortcuts. They are evaluations of something as something that one favors or disfavors. This evaluation is based on information. That information is the content of the attitude. But the way in which the information is taken in the formation of the attitude is driven by motivations. So the attitudes can be the result of motivated, well, they're always the result of motivated cognition, because in my view, all cognition is motivated. But virtues are the result of motivated cognition, where the motive is the motive of accuracy, so getting to the truth, whilst vices are the results of attitudes that are based on the processing of information in a way that is motivated by motives other than accuracy. And in particular, I think of the motives of self-defense, or more specifically defending the ego or self-esteem against perceived threats, and the motive of social adjustment, which is basically a motive of self-presentation, of being accepted by a community to which one would like to be part of. And so this idea that motives are central is also part of the psychological framework motives drive the cognition that leads to the formation of the attitude. And furthermore, once you have the attitudes that have been formed for certain motives, you might deploy these attitudes in conjunction with these motives to lead to further motivated cognition. So that's a summary basically of part one. Part two is putting the framework to work and developing accounts of the various virtues and vices. So in the interest of time, let me just say a little bit about each of these. I think of intellectual humility as a combination of modesty about success and acceptance of limitations. And so I think of humility as a cluster of attitudes that evaluate the self, or more specifically aspects of one's intellectual characters or one's cognitive abilities and so on and so forth, and evaluate them as strengths or weaknesses, and do so in a way that is motivated by the motive of accuracy. Humility is a way of appraising oneself, and is a way of appraising oneself driven by the motive of accuracy. And so is a way of evaluating one's own worth on the basis of what one's worth actually is, but it is possible to make more honest mistakes, and is also possible to be, in very unusual circumstances, unreliable. So a person can be humble and yet be mistaken about what their strengths and weaknesses are in my account. And then there are the vices that are opposed to these virtues, one of which is superbia. I use the Latin term because I don't think the English term pride quite captures it, but it's an evaluation of the self for its self-worth that is wholly dependent on feeling superior to others. So you feel that you're worth anything only if you're better than other people. And then you evaluate all features of your intellectual characters driven by this need to be better than other people, driven by this need to sort of feel that you're only good if you're better than other people. And so I think that the motive that drives these evaluation is ego defense. I also think for every vice that there is a characteristic emotional orientation that goes with it, which also is important in the way in which drives further cognition. And I think for superbia, that's anger. And one of the results of superbia is an inflated but fragile self-confidence, because it's continuously needing to defend itself. Superbia can deepen into arrogance, which is a kind of hyper-autonomy, which is also defensive, but this time is aloof, and is also a sense of inflated self-confidence. But basically, this move from superbia to arrogance happens when you have been able to be so successful in feeling superior to others by means of not always attacking them, by thinking of yourself as so superior that they can't even put you into question. And so the person who is arrogant would be the person that Michael Lynch has defined as the know-it-all, the person who is so convinced that they are always right, that the fact that something is their idea makes in their mind the fact that is right automatic. So that's sort of a deepening of superbia into arrogance. So then you have the vices opposed, which are serviling and self-amazement. And again, you have the first vice being a form of the vice, and the second one being a deepening of it. So servility is basically evaluating your own abilities by using the meter, and the mismeasure of the self, used by the group that despises you. And so your own self-evaluation is driven by the need to be liked by these other people who don't value you. And so the motive is self-adjustment, the emotional orientation is shame, and the typical attitude to self is a deflated self-confidence. I also think it includes a glimmer of hope, but I can't explain why that is here. Self-abasement then is a deepening of servility into a kind of hyper-heteronomy where one just thinks of oneself as being better off if they just adopt the views of the dominant people. And so the emotional orientation is one of self-humiliation. And again, the motivation driving this is social adjustment. And then the other remaining 4 vices are vanity. And here is a high evaluation of the self, but driven by the need of social adjustment. And the emotional orientation is envy. And narcissism, which is a deepening of vanity into a form of self-infatuation. And again, is a form of, is driven by social adjustment, and the emotional orientation is self-love. And then the remaining 2 vices of inferiority, one is timidity. So if superbia is a defensive response of the fight variety, timidity is a defensive response of the flight variety. And so one evaluates oneself lowly, right? Because that low evaluation helps one to become risk averse and to avoid threats. And here the emotional orientation is fear. And then fatalism is a deepening of timidity into a sense of resignation of one's own limitations. And here the emotion is hopelessness. So that gives you a sense of part 2. And part 3, I tried to highlight using a lot of social psychology, both the social psychology of individual differences and social cognition, but primarily the social psychology that takes into account individual differences. So I'm interested not in the way in which human beings in general demonstrate a certain kind of cognitive biases, but I'm interested in the way in which different individuals, right, with different attitudes and different emotional orientation tend to be more or less biased in certain ways. And based on the empirical psychology of that, I show that if virtue vices are based on attitudes in the way I say, we can then explain certain characteristic epistemic harms that come out of these vices. And so these vices are the result of motivated cognition and promote motivated cognition. And so they harm the epistemic performance of the people who have them, and they are likely to make them unreliable. They harm self-trust and self-knowledge because they are some of them are deflated forms of self-trust, and some of them are inflated forms of self-trust, but that can only be preserved by means of deception. And I talk of several self-deceptive strategies that arrogant people use to preserve their inflated sense of self-esteem. But they also cause harm to other people, simply because if you are excessively confident, even when you have no grounds to be confident, you will likely to be misleading other people. People who have superbia and arrogance have to put other people down, so they are likely to commit epistemic injustices. They are likely to intimidate and humiliate other people, and therefore promoting vices in them. I think vanity and narcissism, for instance, tend to bullshit and so undermine a general commitment to the truth. Narcissists tend to like to take the credit for themselves. Vain people tend to like to spoil epistemic goods for other people. This is an example of what envy does. But devices of inferiority too can cause harm to other people by being excessively deferent. You can mislead something that is not really acceptable is acceptable. So if you just, if you just agree with the views of somebody else, even if those views are not worth agreeing with, a third party can be mistaken into thinking, look, they agreed, therefore there must be something to this idea, right? So you can mislead by being excessively deferential. And by being timid, you might fail to disseminate knowledge that you are the only person to possess, and therefore you can harm other people in the epistemic community in this way. So that gives you a sense of the third part, and I will not talk about the fourth. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Alessandra, for those opening remarks. Now we're going to have some comments by Heather Battaly. Heather, take it away.
Terrific. Thank you so much. So first of all, I want to thank Alessandra for a wonderful, marvelous book. Thank you, Alessandra. And thank you so much to Waldo and everybody at Concept for organizing this session. I'm so happy we're doing a session on Alessandra's work. It's terrific work. I'm going to start out by singing the praises of the book. So big picture, Alessandra just introduced us to many of the key ideas in the book. I think it's making crucial contributions to the field of vice epistemology at multiple points. So Alessandra is using insights from vice epistemology, feminist epistemology, and social psychology to generate a comprehensive analysis of the intellectual virtues of humility and pride and their connections to 8 intellectual vices, as she just introduced us to, including vices of superiority like arrogance, which are going to be very familiar to those of us who have been paying attention for the last 5 years to philosophy in the world. But I think really key, Alessandra also focuses on the often neglected vices of inferiority, such as servility and self-abasement. That is just outstanding work. She defends a motivationalist analysis of intellectual vices. She argues that the vices of inferiority erode self-trust. She examines the ways in which we are and aren't blameworthy for our intellectual vices. She raises objections to the standard method for teaching intellectual virtues. Her book as a whole produces a powerful analysis of the virtues and vices of self-evaluation that links vice epistemology to the studies of oppression, accounts of non-voluntarist responsibility, psychological measures of virtues and vices, and to educational methods for facilitating intellectual virtues. So for instance, this is just a few things, a few cool things, right? Alessandra's analysis explains, for instance, why people who are privileged are at risk for vices of superiority, why arrogance and closed-mindedness are likely to be empirically correlated, why persons who are marginalized are at risk for vices of inferiority. And she also explains the double consciousness of persons who are servile and why that's likely to become a self-abasing sense of worthlessness. So I think for all of these reasons, Mismeasure is a pivotal resource for the field of vice epistemology in its future. And indeed, there's so many arguments in the book that merit discussion that it's gleefully hard to figure out what to talk about first. So today, I'm just going to focus on Alessandra's analysis of the intellectual virtue of humility. Alessandra argues that virtues of self-assessment don't require reliability. I'm going to raise a worry about her arguments, but quibbles over details aside, Alessandra and I agree about a lot. And so the worries I'm going to raise today really should be understood as a family squabble among fellow members of the Vice Squad, which I encourage everyone to join. So here's an overview of Alessandra's analysis of humility. As she told us, virtuous humility, on her view, is a combination of two other intellectual virtues: modesty about one's intellectual strengths and acceptance of one's intellectual limitations. Modesty about intellectual strengths is a disposition to have positive attitudes toward one's perceived strengths that's motivated by a desire for accuracy, knowledge, and other epistemic goods. Acceptance of one's intellectual limitations is correspondingly a disposition to have a negative attitude toward one's perceived limitations, also motivated by a desire for accuracy, knowledge, and epistemic goods. So roughly, really roughly here, we can think of people who are virtuously humble, on Alessandra's view, as disposed to favor their perceived accomplishments, skills, and expertise, and disfavor their perceived failures and deficits of skill because they're motivated by a love of epistemic goods. So in other words, because they love truth, they want to accurately assess their strengths and weaknesses in their abilities to get truths. They also want to acknowledge their perceived strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so does virtuous humility require reliability? So Alessandra defines virtuous humility in terms of perceived limitations and strengths rather than actual limitations and strengths. She argues that although virtuously humble people are usually reliable in tracking their actual strengths and limitations, reliable tracking isn't required for virtuous humility. So why not? Why does Alessandra think it's not required? So what I saw in the book is that she's drawing on two different kinds of cases that involve bad luck. It seems to me that first she's arguing that a virtuously humble person might make an honest mistake about her strengths or limitations due to bad luck. For instance, quote, a humble scientist might overestimate the importance of her discovery, which in hindsight might be revealed to be less significant than initially thought. Here, this seems right to me, right? I agree that people can make occasional mistakes like that just due to bad luck. But insofar as they're occasional mistakes rather than consistent mistakes, it seems to me that they won't be enough to impugn agent reliability. So I'm going to set them aside. So I think that the key cases are the following ones, where Alessandra argues that virtuously humble people can consistently make honest mistakes by over or underestimating their strengths and limitations, rendering them unreliable. And here's I think what she has in mind, or what I'm taking her to have in mind. So she says that persons are especially likely to be unreliable about their strengths and limitations when they have the bad luck of forming their attitudes in epistemically hostile or epistemically oppressive environments that give them misleading feedback about their strengths and limitations. So, quote, an individual might be a fool and consistently believe others' overestimation of his abilities without thereby being arrogant, right? And likewise, a well-motivated individual might consistently believe others' underestimation of her abilities while still being virtuously humble. So on her view, possessing a disposition to have false beliefs about one's strengths and limitations doesn't prevent one from being virtuously humble, since it doesn't prevent one from being motivated to have true beliefs about one's strengths and limitations, or from, quote, owning up to whatever limitations or strengths she thinks or perceives that she has. Okay, so it's kind of a subjective notion of owning. So I'm going to suggest that one of the ways oppression can damage character and virtue is by damaging evaluative perception. I suggest that oppression can distort our evaluative perception of our strengths and limitations, preventing us from being appropriately attentive to and aware of them and making us unreliable. Now, I take Alessandra to be agreeing with that much. But I'm further going to suggest that when oppression damages evaluative perception this way, it prevents us from having the virtue of humility, which requires dispositions of appropriate evaluative perception and attentiveness, in addition to dispositions of subjectively appropriate motivation, action, and affect. So to put this differently, I think the bad luck of landing in an epistemically oppressive environment can prevent us from having intellectual virtues by damaging our evaluative perception. As I'm reading her, Alessandra agrees that there are many, many ways in which oppression can make agents epistemically worse off, right? This is one of the great accomplishments of her book, right? So by, for instance, she argues, fostering epistemically bad motivations for social acceptance and ego enhancement, fostering inappropriate intellectual behaviors that are overly deferential or dismissive, fostering unwarranted feelings of intellectual inferiority or superiority, and unreliable beliefs about and perceptions of our strengths and limitations, right? So she agrees that oppression can make agents epistemically worse off in all kinds of ways. Although she thinks all these effects make agents epistemically worse off, and many of these effects detract from the intellectual virtue of humility, she doesn't think unreliable self-assessments detract from the virtue of humility. And that's where she and I disagree. So I want to zoom in a little bit on her arguments for why virtuous humility doesn't require reliability. And she asks us to home in on agents whose evaluative perception of their strengths and limitations is miscalibrated due to the bad luck of landing in an epistemic environment that's oppressive, but who've escaped the other bad effects of oppression enumerated above, right? So their evaluative perception of their strengths and limitations is skewed by being in an oppressive environment, but the oppressive environment hasn't impacted their epistemic motivations or their owning. Okay, so they still have good epistemic motivations and their owning is still subjectively appropriate. So think about the fool or the puffed up fellow example that Miranda Fricker gives us in her book, Epistemic Injustice, right? The fool's privileged along multiple axes of his social identity. He consequently receives misleading systematic feedback about his many and varied strengths, and he develops a disposition to overestimate his strengths and underestimate his limitations. He'll think he has many strengths he doesn't in fact have. He'll think he deserves a credit for accomplishments that aren't his. This is classic fool behavior. And will be oblivious to many of his limitations. His limitations won't tend to pop up on his evaluative radar, nor would he be inclined to believe and accept that he had them if they did. And at the extreme, the fool's evaluative perception of his strengths and limitations may be so skewed that he massively over-attributes strengths to himself and only succeeds in being aware of a tiny handful of his limitations. On Tanesini's view, he still counts as being virtuously humble, given that he's motivated to have true beliefs about his limitations and owns the handful of limitations he does think he has. At least I think that's Alessandra's view. She'll correct me if I've misinterpreted her. So now consider an agent who's marginalized along multiple axes of her social identity, who consequently receives misleading systemic feedback about her many and varied limitations, and who thus develops a disposition to overestimate her limitations and underestimate her strengths. This agent will think she has many limitations that she doesn't have. She'll think she doesn't deserve credit for accomplishments that are in fact hers, and she'll be oblivious to many of her strengths. They won't pop up on her evaluative radar, and she wouldn't be inclined to accept them if they did. Okay, at the extreme, her evaluative perception of her limitations and strengths may be so skewed that she massively over-attributes limitations to herself and isn't successful, and is only successful in being aware of a tiny handful of her strengths. On Alessandra's view, I think, as I'm reading her, this person still counts as being virtuously humble, given that she's motivated to have true beliefs about her limitations and owns the limitations she thinks she has. So Tanesini agrees that these agents are epistemically worse off than agents who reliably assess their limitations and strengths, that they would be better off if the perception wasn't damaged, if they were reliable, and they were observant of their strengths and limitations, and they replaced their ignorance with self-knowledge. I think Alessandra agrees with all of that, right? As she might put it, and she mentioned this in her introduction, the agents above would be epistemically better off if they had the reliable, virtuous sensibility of being observant of or attentive to their strengths and limitations. So the sticking point, the point of disagreement here, is whether such damage to evaluative perception damages intellectual character virtues, and here specifically the virtue of humility. Alessandra thinks it doesn't. She thinks the reliable, virtuous sensibility of being attentive to one's strengths and limitations is not itself a constituent of the character virtue of humility. And I'm going to suggest that something like the sensibility of being observant is a constituent of the. So what I'll end up doing briefly is just starting to motivate an externalist account where virtuous humility requires reliability. So on one common account of the virtues, which traces its origin to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, part of what it is to have any character virtue is to reliably notice when and which features of the world call for the motivations, actions, and affective responses that are characteristic of that virtue. So on this account, the world doesn't come labeled with evaluative saliences, and we can be unaware of or mistaken about what's salient. And part of what it is to become virtuous is to learn to perceive what is and isn't evaluatively salient in the world, to acquire a reliable saliency detector. So as Aristotelians might put it, part of what it is to have a character virtue is to have fine-grained perception of the relevant particulars, right? To discriminate what's salient and do so correctly. So in short, this account makes reliable perception partly constitutive of character virtues, whether they're moral or intellectual character virtues. So here, part of what it is to have the virtue of humility is to be disposed to successfully notice when we do and don't have limitations and strengths and what they are and aren't. This means that I can't be oblivious to my limitations, as the fool is, and be virtuously humble, nor can I consistently perceive qualities of mine to be limitations when they aren't, as the marginalized person above does, and still be virtuously humble, okay? So what this points toward is an account of a virtue of humility that includes reliable attentiveness as a constitutive part. So where virtuous humility consists in appropriate attentiveness to and owning of one's limitations and strengths, as one's motivated by episteme. On one, but not the only reading of this account, appropriate attentiveness consists in reliably detecting the limitations and strengths one has, and appropriate owning partly consists in reliably believing and accepting that one has the limitations and strengths that one detects through appropriate attentiveness. So the idea is that appropriate attentiveness plays the role of reliable evaluative perception. It is the reliable saliency detector. And the cognitive dispositions that are partly constitutive of appropriate owning supply reliable beliefs about one's limitations and strengths. So to put this in the words Tanesini's using in her framework, this account would make the virtuous sensibility of being observant a constitutive part of the character virtue of humility. One potential advantage of an externalist account like this is that in making reliable perception of one's limitations and strengths partly constitutive of the virtues of self-assessment, the account can explain how the misleading feedback caused by oppression damages character and does so even when it doesn't damage motivation. So the feedback doesn't just damage character by damaging evaluative perception, by damaging the agent's access to our limitations and strengths. The damage that results from damaged evaluative perception reverberates. So even if nothing else goes wrong and the agent owns what she perceives to be her limitations and strengths, if her perceptions don't track her actual limitations and strengths, if she doesn't start off on the right foot, her owning isn't going to be appropriate either. To own appropriately on this account, one must respond appropriately to the qualities supplied by appropriate attentiveness. If one's attentiveness isn't appropriate to begin with, if one starts off by attending to the wrong qualities, then one's owning won't be appropriate. In short, in damaging the agent's perception of her actual limitations and strengths, oppression also damages her subsequent owning. And there's a couple of different ways it does that. Adding insult to injury when oppression damages an agent's perception of their limitations and strengths may also damage their ability to detect that they've been damaged, right? It may make the agent unaware of their unreliable perception of their limitations and strengths and unaware of the impact of that unreliable perception on their owning, their cognitive, behavioral, and affective dispositions that are parts of owning. So as Jose Medina might put it, it might make them meta blind to that. So on the externalist account above, the misleading systemic feedback caused by oppression doesn't just damage our perception of ourselves and prevent us from gaining self-knowledge, but in so doing prevents us from gaining the virtue of humility. In this way, the externalist account above could serve as an additional conceptual resource, both for persons who are marginalized and for persons who are privileged, and all of whom are damaged by the misleading feedback that stems from oppression. So finally, I want to thank Alessandra for this fantastic book. So the quibbles between these views, I think, are small potatoes, given the tremendous contribution that Mismeasure makes to vice epistemology and to the literature on humility. And my hope is that, what I've done here begins to demonstrate the depth that is characteristic of Alessandra's analysis throughout Mismeasure. And I'm grateful to her for writing a book that will be an outstanding resource for future work on epistemic virtues and vices. So thank you, Alessandra.
Thank you for the excellent comments, Heather. Our next comments are going to be from Mona Simion. At the end, we're going to have a roundtable time to get questions from everyone, hear some feedback from Alessandra. But right now we're going to move on to Mona. So Mona, take it away.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for having me. It was great to read the book, although I kind of knew what was happening in there because I was at Cardiff when Alessandra was working on the book. So we chatted, I think, over drinks a lot about it. So I had quite an easy time now reading it because some of this material was familiar already and also, brought back nice memories. So in a nutshell, I think the book is excellent, but I might be influenced by the quality of the drinks when we were discussing it. We're never going to know. So yeah, the book was fantastic. fantastic. I only sent Alessandra my slides a couple of days ago because I struggled kind of finding something to say that was critical and it made any sense at all. I think that what I like about the book most is the ambition, because it is not only that it's a very systematic and comprehensive picture of the nature and normativity of epistemic vice, but it's also very thoroughly empirically informed. And I remember conferences joined with psychologists that Alessandra would organize when she was working on this book, and how complicated everything that was happening in those conferences was. So I think that, we should all learn from how this book was made, in that we like to think about ourselves as being empirically informed a lot, at least many of us do. But what we actually mean by that is that we Googled some stuff about cognitive science and politically motivated reasoning, usually. That's at least how I do it. But Alessandra, she did it thoroughly. She actually, had collaborated with psychologists. She had joint conferences with them. And trust me, some of these people can be quite nasty. So and it shows in the book, right? I mean, it's really amazing how much cool empirical stuff you can find in this book. And of course, it's also really hard to keep it together with, kind of normative cushioness, as it were, when you work with empirical stuff. And the book does that really well. I really loved it. So the ambition of the book that I'm going to try to challenge today is the ambition to stay autonomous. So Alessandra says at some point, I don't have the exact quote, that she doesn't want to belong to either tradition, neither to the reliabilist tradition, nor straightforwardly to the responsibilist Exexian tradition, and furthermore that she just doesn't want to belong to the the normal kind of mainstream way of doing epistemology by caring about what have you, knowledge and justification and so on. And this is not only an ambition that is methodological, but it's also an ambition that we're supposed to see in the view. And as it is described, the view does go in the direction of delivering the goods on this ambition, in that on Alessandra's view, the foundation of vice reality, as it were, so the metaphysics of vice, if you want, has to do with attitudes in the psychological sense of the word, right? So not in the kind of philosophical, straightforward, taking propositional as object type of attitudes, but in a valence evaluative kind of way. I'm not going to talk more about this because those of you who've looked at the book are going to know the difference. I personally doubt that there's a difference there. I think that the psych attitudes are just a subspecies of philosophical attitudes, whereby they just pick a particular variety of valence. And I think that propositional attitudes are also valenced, only in a different way. They're not pleasure valence, they're maybe epistemically valenced or whatever, but I'm going to set this aside. So the point is that the reality of vice is supposed to be constituted by these attitudes. That's supposed to be the main kind of grain participating in the constitution. And in that is not going to be responsibility nor reliability that's going to play the soprano in this picture. So how does this work? So the point is that epistemic vice are taken to be essentially based or sourced or grounded. It's not very clear to be which of this is, or maybe, or even it's kind of, it needs to be only one particular relation that obtains in particular attitudes towards the self. And it's an internalist view, as far as I can tell, in that the presence of the vice, as Heather also well put it, is to some extent environmentally independent, right? So it is independent of the accuracy of the vice constitutive beliefs about oneself, right? So Alessandra tells us very clearly that all of these vices can coexist with accuracy. It might well be that I have I think very well about myself, and I am actually quite smart. But the problem is that the one is not sourced in the other. So I don't think well about myself because I have evidence that I'm actually quite smart, but rather because of all of this attitudes that I have, valenced attitudes that I have. And also, secondly, another way in which these vices are environmentally independent is in that the epistemic valence of the corresponding doxastic consequences doesn't matter for them, right? So while it is, according to Alessandra, likely to be the case that these vices are going to have bad epistemic consequences, and she talks a bit about how this usually happens and what kind of the effects are on the victim, as it were, of the vice, so on the bearer on the vice, but also on other people's epistemic lives. The point is that these are not essential. So in that is not a reliabilist view, because these vices don't need to have these bad consequences in order to count as vices. It's just the case that they likely do, or that as a matter of fact, in the world that we inhabit, they tend to do so. Okay, so what I do today is I argue against this vice internalism, and by arguing against this vice internalist, notice that I also de facto argue against Alessandra's autonomy claim, because this variety of internalists that is kind of tries to stay off accuracy considerations is what gives it the alleged autonomy from the reliabilist tradition. So indeed, you are right. What I'm going to talk about is very similar to what Heather talked about. So what I'm going to argue for, I'm going to try to argue for very briefly, is that epistemic vices are epistemic vices, only they're environmentally individuated. And I'm gonna only talk, I can't talk about all the vices that Alessandra discusses. I'm only gonna pick my favorite ones, which are the vices of self-satisfaction, which are the ones that Alessandra and I talked a lot about, because I always suspected that she's writing about me when she's writing about self-satisfied people. And I indeed asked her, and she did not say no on a couple of occasions. So when I read her book, I felt quite guilty by the end of it. So I'm going to talk about things like narcissism and superbia, as it were, but in general terms. But I hope that what I say will apply to the general framework, and you just change the valence or change from good to bad or whatever, in order to talk about the timidity and so on. All right. So here's what Alessandra tells us about these vices of self-satisfaction. These individuals adopt a self-satisfied stance towards what they regard as their intellectual strengths. They believe that a great number of their intellectual features are impressive. Those individuals are also often averse to working towards improvement. Yes, indeed. They adopt this stance because they believe that they are already great and thus have no need to improve. Hence, their mindset is fixed, since they judge themselves to be naturally talented and thus capable of effortless success. So in a nutshell, what we can see is that these vices of self-satisfaction are individuated by the corresponding psych attitude. Accuracy doesn't matter, right? So my self-satisfied beliefs about myself may well be luckily true. Indeed, I believe they are. But the reason why I have them is not because I have evidence that they're true, but because I have this narcissistic, for instance, attitude towards myself, right? So I have this attitude of self-admiration, and that's what's delivering these beliefs about my being very smart. What's crucial to vice presence is that these beliefs of mine are not sourced in or based on evidence about my actual capabilities, but rather they're sourced in or based on mistaken self-directed attitudes like self-admiration, self-defense, and whatever else is happening, depending on the relevant vice. So here is Alessandra on the truth independence claim. We should expect narcissistic and self-satisfied self-evaluations to be off the mark by underestimating shortcomings and overestimating strengths. But it doesn't need to be the case, right? So however, in unusual circumstances, it is possible that such individuals may have impressive intellectual strengths, and through sheer luck, their self-assessments may prove to be largely accurate. The person with narcissistic tendencies, for example, is disposed to bullshit even though so it's not about me, holds true beliefs about his capacities. What makes his claims about the self, among other things, bullshit is that he does not care whether they are true. Okay, so here's why I don't like the truth independence claim. I think it gives us an implausible picture, both empirically and epistemologically. And remember that that's the hard thing to put together, right? It's hard. It's a very hard thing. And Alessandra did a fantastic job to put together a lot of empirical work with very heavily normative epistemological work, right? But of course, because it's hard, it sometimes happens, as I would like to claim it did in this particular case, that the two pull in different directions. So there's a tension there, right? So I think that, so take the following case, and I'll tell you what I think afterwards. I believe, so say that I believe that I'm super good at maths, which I do, and that's not due to self-admiration, but due to self-admiration alone. So I start off with this belief in life. I admire myself very much in all walks of life. Thereby, I come to admire myself in terms of mathematical capabilities as well. So I have this belief now. It's totally sourced in this wishful thinking kind of thing, self-admiration. And I have no evidence whatsoever. So what do I do tomorrow? Well, I go ahead and do some maths because that kind of makes sense, right? Now that I think that I'm very good at it, well, why not go ahead and do some maths? And if Alessandra is right, it is possible that I am actually good at maths, right? So now what's happening now that I'm doing maths? I'm getting things right all the time because I am actually fantastically, naturally talented at maths, right? And I go on like that in life. So now the claim that I want to make is that I can't be a narcissist anymore, because now I have inductive evidence that I'm good at maths. And it would be utterly strange for me to continue to base my belief on self-admiration when there's this inductive evidence that keeps coming at me. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it's implausible. So, I keep getting this evidence, but my belief that I'm good at it remains stubbornly based in self-admiration and refuses to update in any way with this fantastic evidence that I get that I am indeed good at maths, right? So again, I'm saying implausible, not impossible. It is not logically impossible. It is not unconceivable that someone, as I just described, would totally ignore this inductive evidence and continue basing their belief in self-admiration, right? I just think it's psychologically implausible. And here is why. It's not that we can't resist evidence. We're very good at resisting evidence. We do it all the time. The problem is that we resist evidence that we don't like. That's our psychological tendency, right? So I don't like women. I'm going to resist evidence that they're good at maths, right? If I want to believe really strongly that they're stupid, as soon as I see a woman that does really well at maths, I'm going to try to find a different explanation of this datum in order to resist the evidence against my preferred belief that women are not good at maths, right? So that's how we do it. We reject evidence out of, motivation or wishful thinking or whatever, but we reject evidence that doesn't agree with what we already believe. We don't really reject evidence that reinforces our beliefs, right? To the contrary, we embrace it. So it is psychologically highly implausible to think that even though I keep being good at maths, my belief that I'm good at maths remains solely, importantly, solely sourced in my self-admiration, right? It is implausible that that basis doesn't get infected at all with the inductive evidence. So how about maybe, so if that's the case, notice that we not only is it that the vice can't survive for long because I end up having a justified belief, but it's also that there is no vice because the vice requires some stability. So in the cases I described it, I had this vicious, if you want, belief initially, this wishful thinking belief sourced in self-admiration, but this one belief that doesn't make a vice. But, the next day, the next thing that happened is it started being sourced in proper inductive evidence. So it's really hard to be a narcissist when you're really good at stuff because you keep getting evidence that you're good at stuff. That is going to become part of your basis in normal psychological circumstances, right? So insofar as what we care about is psychological plausibility, this view is not going to fly. Vice and accuracy is not going to coincide very well. How about the model version? So maybe what Alessandra wants to say is, look, it is a vice. You're still a narcissist, even when this happens, because you would have believed it anyway. Even if you hadn't had all the successes in maths, you are so self-admiring that you would have believed you're good at maths, even against all the evidence that you're bad. That's what the vice does to you, after all. Sure, but now notice that if we want this kind of model version of the account of vice that Alessandra proposes, it becomes a bit less plausible epistemologically. So again, the two ways of being plausible pull in different direction. The version that we discussed so far, it's modally okay, it's epistemologically possible, but psychologically implausible. The account that we're looking at now is psychologically plausible, but epistemologically implausible. Why? Well, first of all, because basing is not plausibly modally described. So just because, so now that I believe I see all this evidence that I'm good at maths and I could, update my beliefs in terms of it, it is implausible to think that just because I would have believed it anyway, it follows that my current belief now is not based on this inductive evidence. It is based on this inductive evidence, even though I would have had it, even if the inductive evidence hadn't existed, right? Also, it's also an implausible view of vice because even if Alessandra doesn't want to talk about knowledge, one thing that we know is that you can't get knowledge through epistemic vice. But the simple way to put it is knowledge implies non-vice. But in the case that I described in maths, I know that I'm good at maths after my inductive basis is large enough. So that's the problem, I think, with the claim that vice can of self-admiration can correspond with accuracy. I think that that's not possible. I think that it is either psychologically implausible or epistemologically implausible, depending on how you describe it as a claim of actuality or as a model claim. Okay, how about the consequence independence claim? So remember that Alessandra was making two environmental independence claims. One, that accuracy about beliefs about oneself doesn't matter. And secondly, that the consequences don't matter. So it doesn't matter whether these vices result in bad epistemic consequences or not. They do so on a regular basis, but it's not essential to them that they do. It can be that they never do. So here's Alessandra. Independently of whether some such individuals genuinely possess impressive skills or abilities, their safe complacency is likely to prove a hindrance in the successful pursuit of their intellectual goals. So it's just a claim about likelihood. Having the measure of one's epistemic strengths and weaknesses is, in ordinary circumstances, a prerequisite for success. It is not essential, but it is normally a prerequisite for success. So here's why I don't like the consequence independence claim. It seems to me as though if vice fails to lead reliably to bad epistemic consequences, it is not an epistemic vice in one of two ways. It is either not a vice at all, or it is a vice, but it is not an epistemic one. So let me try to very briefly argue for this claim. A lot can be said here, and Heather has already said a lot of things. But here's why I believe it. So maths is an example in which there is, no bad consequence to my vice, right? And we just saw that there is plausibly no vice at all in that case, right? So I form a belief that I'm very good at maths based on self-admiration, and the result is that I'm right all the time. I'm right. Whenever I believe that I'm good at maths, I turn out to be right. And you can see how when that happens, because of the update from the inductive basis, I end up without having a vice. That's what we just looked at, right? So it can be that either I end up without the vice when I'm right, or it might be that it is indeed a case in which I have a lot of accuracy, but I don't have other epistemic goods, right? So Norman the Clairvoyant is a case like that. Norman the Clairvoyant gets it right all the time, right? And he is indeed plausibly a vicious creature. His clairvoyance is an epistemic vice. He's, forming clairvoyant beliefs. He shouldn't do that. But notice that he's missing other epistemic goods that many of us have argued are more important and central to epistemology than truth, like justification and knowledge. Okay, so how about, aren't there going to be any cases in which even knowledge is present, but still there's epistemic vice at stake? How about, for instance, knowledge-generating dispositions sourced in self-admiration, right? So how about if what happens is something along the lines of, well, I am a narcissist, I'm really, believe that I'm going to be really, really good at philosophy. And the result of this kind of, self-admiring attitude is that I'm actually less anxious when I go into a conference or when I read philosophy. And I actually gain more knowledge because I'm not very anxious because of this totally crazy self-admiring attitude. I think that that's actually true about myself. So, if that's the case, shouldn't we say that what's going on here is that I have a vice, and that it does, on this occasion, coincide with knowledge generation? Shouldn't this case, the case of me getting more knowledge through this crazy self-admiration, shouldn't this case prove that Alessandra's account is correct? And I think it doesn't, because I think it is plausible in this case that I'm a vicious person, but not an epistemically vicious person. So as far as I can tell, I am in the same category as a patient that, ends up being better, so surviving the illness just because he's an optimist. optimist patients, we know from tons of empirical studies, do better, recover better than pessimist patients, right? And we don't think that those people are epistemically vicious. We just call them optimists. That's not, hasn't been argued a lot by the Vice Squad as an epistemic vice. So in a nutshell, I think that when good epistemic consequences are present and accuracy about self-beliefs is present, we either don't get vice at all, or if we get vice, we might get some other variety of vice. Maybe it's bad socially to be self-admiring like that, in spite of the epistemic goods that you get. Maybe it's bad morally. Maybe it's bad emotionally. Maybe there are other ways in which you're vicious, but I don't think it's epistemic. So I guess the moral of the story is, according to me at least, that there's a difference between epistemic vices and mere vices with epistemic content. So vices about intellectual stuff, about our epistemic behavior. We can be exhibiting moral vices in our epistemic behavior, but just because they're, our epistemic behavior is morally suspicious, it doesn't follow that it's also epistemically suspicious. Yeah, that's all. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mona. That was the second of our commentators. We have comments from a couple of other commentators before we'll hear from Alessandra. So next up, we have Aidan McGlynn. Aidan, would you like to start up here? Did you have a presentation you're going to share?
Yes, so let's see if I can share that. Okay, so yeah, thanks a lot for having me and for giving me the chance to engage with Alexandra's, I think, just fantastic book. I think, like the other participants, I have the sense that this is kind of the first time I'm engaging with it, and it's definitely not going to be the last. As I think Heather said, it just feels like such a resource for people working in, vice epistemology, but also social epistemology and feminist epistemology and various other areas. As my title, for those of you who've read the book, might suggest, I'm actually focused right at the end of the book on the bit that Alessandra didn't talk about at all. So I think that works quite well, because I can maybe give a flavor of the discussion if I do a reasonable job of conveying what she said there, and raise some points which hopefully invite Alessandra to talk a bit more about that bit in the later section of the discussion. So let me just start with a quote from, I actually can't see the entire quote, just give me a second. The scene I'm picturing is Jane Austen's Emma dealing with the fact that she's just been proposed to by Mr. Elton, and she takes it to just be obvious that Mr. Elton is beneath her. And so she's trying to think about, she's in distress at the start, and she consoles herself with the following thought. Oops. Perhaps it was not quite fair of him to expect, him to feel how very much he was her inferior in talent and all the elegances of mind. The very want of such equality might prevent his perception of it. So in an earlier paper, I mentioned this quote and used it to try and illustrate certain kinds of theses that some people have made about discussions of skepticism. So here's a version of this from Tim Williamson. So this is a quote from Knowledge and Its Limits. If one is in the bad case, so the case in which you're deceived by the evil demon, or you're in the matrix or something, if you're in the bad case and one does not know that one is not in the good case, even if one pessimistically believes that one is not in the good case, one's true belief does not constitute knowledge. Part of the badness of the bad case is one cannot know just how bad one's case is. And that's kind of analogous, I thought, to Mr. Elton's predicament, that he's so badly off that he can't even tell how badly off he is. So I think it does capture something about a certain dynamic in skepticism in that traditional discussion in epistemology. I think even better, it discusses why certain intellectual vices in particular seem particularly stubborn. It captures that sense that those who suffer from them will, just in virtue of actually the vice itself, be particularly badly placed to recognize that they suffer from it. So as Alessandra says, Kassim Kassam has talked about these as stealthy vices. Again, in virtue of the vice, they may be lacking in the motivation to effect any change in themselves. They don't see the need, they don't feel any pull to, and so on. I'll come back to that little comparison with skepticism briefly at the end. The final shortest chapter is on the prospects of using education to educate people as an ameliorative attempt to kind of undo the consequences, the harms done by their epistemic vices, and get them and the rest of the community kind of back on track. And to do so despite this kind of Mr. Elton-like dynamic where they seem really badly placed to appreciate even that they have any issues that need worked on, which seem to suggest that any kind of attempt to educate them out of their intellectual vices might just be doomed to failure. It's going to confront the very vices and fail because of the vices which you're trying to ameliorate. And what Alessandra does is present us with 4 options, and 2 of them get quite quickly kind of jettisoned as fairly unpromising. The third, Alessandra thinks, is promising, but crucially limited in scope. And then we get this final proposal that closes the book that's meant to give us some cautious optimism at the end of the book that there is something we can do to push past even the limits of the third one. So it's very abstract, but just in brief, we get the idea that we might try and engage in explicit education about virtue and what virtue requires. And just very quickly, this is not meant to do justice to either the topic or Alessandra's discussion, but just the flavor. Doesn't seem to, that kind of dry education might not impart any motivation to cultivate the virtues as you're told about them. There might be structural obstacles even when that motivation is present that mean that particular virtues just don't seem to be able to be formed in this kind of way. And Alessandra discusses humility, for example, here. And then again, it seems to confront this Mr. Elton-like circular kind of dynamic where that kind of attempt to educate people just seems like it's not going to get traction with people who are subject to these epistemic vices. They're not going to be suitably open-minded. They're not going to have the relevant kind of self-awareness, strength of will, and so on. Habituation is another thought, and there's a few worries. One thing that Alessandra mentions is we want to avoid thinking of this as anything like kind of Pavlovian conditioning, where what you're doing is just kind of instilling a kind of pattern of mindless repetition into people. So you're not really getting them to develop virtues at all. You're actually instilling them to a kind of zombie-like repetition of certain behaviors, which looks like it's actually in tension with cultivating something that's virtuous, which is kind of open-ended in the right way and all the rest of it. There's a couple other things that Alessandra talks about in terms of worries with this proposal, but I'll leave them here for the sake of time, move on to the one which I'm really, I think, most interested in, which is the idea that we should be presenting people with exemplars which are meant to be examples that people could come to emulate in their intellectual lives in ways that would kind of knock them back on track if they're subject to one of these vices. These have been thought to have promise in moral education, so that there could be moral exemplars is meant to be something which we might use to cultivate moral virtue. And Alessandra does think, from what I can tell, that there's some evidence that it works, but only in the case where you've got somebody who's kind of at least somewhat on track. They already have some of the relevant motivations, some of the relevant capacities. They're not already mired in the kind of intellectual vices that we're trying to ameliorate the effects of. And so that's the conclusion that she draws. She argues that it's, if adopted on its own, extremely unlikely to be effective for those individuals who are most in need of intellectual character transformation. The thought is those who are subject to these vices of superiority that we've already had a couple of presentations talking about, so arrogance and things like that. These are likely to react with, to these exemplars with spiteful envy of egotism rather than with any emulation. So that's the case where they recognize that the exemplar is in some sense placed as superior to them. But there's a thought which is going to be crucial for what I go on to say in a moment, that if they don't recognize the person as sufficiently superior, if we try and get around the defensiveness of the people who are subject to these vices of superiority by presenting with exemplars which are not going to trigger that kind of aggressive reaction, envious or egotistical reaction, they might see themselves as already having most of the virtues of this person. They kind of don't see anything which prompts any kind of motivation to change. There's a kind of dilemma. Either we present them with exemplars which are placed as superior to them, in which case you prompt this kind of negative reaction, or you try and disarm that kind of reaction, but end up not really showing them why they should change, because the person will just say, well, either I'm superior to them or they're at least no better than me. Likewise, the vices of inferiority, Alessandra says, these exemplars may elicit despondency. So what Alessandra proposes is self-affirmation as an intervention that might improve, that might get past this limitation of the exemplar system. So she says this involves directing people to reflect on the values that are most central to them as people, with the aim of better understanding which values they endorse and the reasons why these are important to them. And the main thing this is meant to do, as far as I can tell, how I'm interpreting the proposal, is it's meant to erode the defensiveness which Alessandra characterizes earlier in the book as part of what underlies, in particular, arrogance, but maybe some of these other vices. And she does also argue, though I don't really go into the details here, that this self-affirmation kind of intervention would have benefits for the other intellectual vices as well. For example, it might have a good effect on those suffering from intellectual timidity. So what I want to do, just very quickly to close, is to make 2 points which I are trying to kind of nudge us a bit back towards paying attention to the third option, the one which Alessandra took to be somewhat promising with some evidence, but not really having important limitations, which she thinks her own proposal pushes past. So first point is I wasn't entirely sure how Alessandra's proposal is meant to avoid one of the objections to exemplarism that I discussed a moment ago. So as we saw a moment ago, one proposal that comes up in discussions of exemplarism is the idea that maybe we need to have exemplars who aren't like superhuman ideals, unrealistically kind of good at what they're doing, unrealistically virtuous, because that would trigger, for example, a demoralizing attitude from those suffering from vices of inferiority, and it would trigger defensiveness and envy from those with a superiority complex. But that looks like a case already which is trying to do something like the same work as the proposal that Alessandra herself endorses. It looks like it's an attempt to disarm that reaction, especially amongst the kind of people with a superiority complex of defensiveness. You're kind of bringing somebody down, you're not presenting them as kind of over and above that person in terms of virtue, at least not to a kind of intimidating degree that would prompt a defensive reaction. So it looked like it was kind of similar in spirit to something that we've already seen when we talked about the exemplars. And there it seemed to me that one moral of discussing that kind of proposal was that just disarming the person's, neutralizing their defensive reactions isn't enough to give them any kind of motivation to work on themselves. So the person who has a superiority complex who gets presented with somebody they don't recognize as superior or being presented as superior, we said didn't seem to have any motivation to then emulate that person at all. In fact, they might take themselves to already have all the relevant virtues. So I guess, yeah, the thought is neutralizing defensiveness doesn't seem to be enough to really get people who are in that position, who are vicious in that particular way, to do much else. And I wasn't entirely sure how the self-affirmation proposal was meant to push past this. It looked like there was a kind of similar worry that if all it's doing is kind of eroding that defensive reaction, I wasn't then clear what the kind of next part of the story was as to how that was meant to ameliorate the vices that the person has. So I wasn't sure that this really did get us beyond the limitations of the other view. But I also just, as a final point, wasn't entirely sure that we need to do that. So I've written a paper a while ago and kind of picking up on Jose Medina's comparisons between these kind of stealthy vices and things like that, those dynamics, and skepticism. In discussions of skepticism in mainstream epistemology, quite often you'll find epistemologists just give up on the project of saying that we can kind of, that a proposal to do away with skepticism has to meet the challenge of getting somebody who's already subject to skeptical doubts to kind of see the error of their ways, or to, in some sense, meet the skeptic on their own terms. You have to reframe the discussion and ignore the skeptic's terms if you're to make progress. So this is a broadly speaking dogmatist view that you get from Jim Pryor and a different from, again, Williamson. And analogously, I'm not sure how much of a constraint we should see it on these ameliorative proposals, that it doesn't manage to educate people out of the vices which seem kind of analogous to the person who's in the kind of worst case skeptical scenario, the people where the vices themselves have become kind of self-sustaining to such a degree that education and these other proposals just doesn't really seem like it's all that apt to do very much. I just don't know that having the power to reach these people and to ameliorate their vices, I don't know how much of a constraint we want it to be. So if that's right, then maybe the limitations of exemplarism shouldn't worry us too much. Of course, if there are other proposals around that do much better, then we should go for them instead, or perhaps better. And maybe Alessandra would be tempted by this, we should do them in tandem. But again, to come back to the first point, I wasn't entirely clear how self-affirmative interventions were meant to improve on exemplarism in that way by reaching the kind of most viciously entrenched. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. McGlynn, for those excellent comments. We have one more set of comments, and then we're going to hear from Alessandra. So Natalie, if you would like to say what you thought about the book, then we'll be ready to move forward with our roundtable discussion.
And thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. And of course, congratulations to Alessandra on the book. I also like it. If you were wondering, if I kind of thought it'd be funny if the fourth person came in and said it was terrible, but I really, really liked it as well. And so my comments today are going to be mostly complimentary. So the plan is that I'm going to, quite self-indulgently, I'm going to focus on one of my favorite things about the book, which is the social structural approach that Alessandra takes to vice epistemology. And I'm going to do this in 3 very quick steps. So first, I'm going to explain what I mean by the social approach. Then I'm going to briefly talk about the social approach to the causes of vices and why I think that this is such a great thing to do, why I think the book works so well. Then I'm going to focus on talking about the social approach to tackling vices. And I think that this is really good as well, but I'm going to point out something that seemed to me to be an omission. And I'm going to raise some questions, which I'd be interested to hear Alessandra's thoughts on, of some ways that I think perhaps this part of the social approach could be strengthened. So what do I mean by the social approach? So right at the start of the book, Alessandra outlines several ways, I think 3 different ways in which her approach is social. And the one which is of most interest to me, the one which I'm talking about today, is that this approach is sensitive to the social and systematic causes of oppression. And this is captured in the quote that I've put on the slide. So Alessandra says that one characteristic objection to virtue and vice epistemologies is that they focus on the individual. And that is something that I sometimes feel when I've read other work on virtue and vice epistemology. But Alessandra promises that her study of vices is a study of oppression. And so although vices manifest in individuals, she's aware that their causes are structural. And I think that this point about causes is borne out really clearly in the book. So Alessandra identifies, as people have already spoken about, she identifies vices of superiority, which are haughtiness, arrogance, narcissism, and vanity. And she shows how these are associated with positions of privilege. And she also points out vices of inferiority, which are civility, self-abasement, fatalism, and timidity. And she shows how these are associated with positions of subordination. And so I really like this recognition of the social causes of intellectual vice. And I think this is really important. And I think it's a big part of why Alessandra's work strikes such a strong chord with so many people. Her analysis of vice is embedded in genuine social dynamics, and it's vividly recognizable. When you read it, you can think of the kind of people that she's talking about. And so this work helps us to understand real individuals that we encounter, and it will help a lot of people to understand themselves. So I like this social approach to the causes of vice. And now I'm going to move on to talking about the solutions that Alessandra offers for tackling vices and whether these live up to the promise of a social approach. So I think the most obvious point where Alessandra talks about tackling vices from a social point of view is in this quote, which again I've put on the slide. So she says that the most effective way to tackle these vices is at the societal level. They are caused by structural injustice, and so addressing them means addressing that structural injustice. So I completely agree with this. This is exactly the kind of structural response I was hoping for, so I'm very happy to read this point. But I want to clarify something before I go on, and I think this is something that Alessandra knows, but I want to clarify it for everybody who is listening. So vices aren't just caused by oppression, they also help to perpetuate it. So we saw Alexandra explaining earlier about all of the epistemic harms and injustices that can come from having vices. And so oppression causes the vices, but then vices help to maintain that oppression. So there's a cycle going on. And so I think when Alessandra says that we need to tackle vices at the societal level, I don't think she means let's independently go off and solve structural inequality somehow, and then that will get rid of vices. What she's talking about is that tackling vices is part of dismantling structural inequality. And so what we need, and what she's offering in this book, is a plan for addressing vices at that structural level, rather than just thinking of them as a trait of individuals. So let's have a look at how she suggests we do this. The suggestion at the heart of the book is that those who have intellectual vices, or the relevant intellectual vices that she talks about, they lack the correct measure of themselves. This self-understanding, or their self-understanding, is warped by the desire for self-acceptance or by the desire for ego defense, and so they don't judge themselves correctly. And Alessandra's suggestion for how they can overcome this is that they should take responsibility for their intellectual vices and for their resulting bad beliefs. And what taking responsibility means in this context is acknowledging that they have the vices that they do and acquiring the motivation to do something about it. Now, Alessandra acknowledges that this isn't easy. It's a very difficult thing to do. She points out that these vices are often stealthy. This is something that other people have talked about today as well. These vices are hard to detect because the kind of vices they are obstructs their own detection. So it's difficult, it's often difficult for people to see these vices in themselves. And I don't remember if anyone's talked about this today, but Alessandra also points out that it's difficult for others to point these vices out to people. So she draws on some empirical literature about labeling and suggests that if we're to label people as vicious, or if we're to say that somebody is arrogant or timid, it might make them be even more so. It's counterproductive to do that. So the solution that Alessandra goes for is education. And specifically, she talks about an exercise called self-affirmation. So self-affirmation interventions aim to make people's self-worth more secure and make them less reliant on others for validation. And the exercise that Alessandra describes involves asking individuals to list values that they see as central to themselves as people, and to write a paragraph justifying their choices. And Alessandra's suggestion is that this will reduce the defensiveness and fear which is behind, or which are the motivations behind the intellectual vices that she's talking about. And so once this is done, then other educational strategies like exemplars, modeling exemplars, as Aidan was talking about, these can then come in. But as I understand it, the vicious motivations need to be weakened before this can happen, and then those things come in as an extra step. So that's a very brief summary of Alessandra's proposal for tackling vices. Vicious individuals need to be encouraged to take responsibility so they can gain the measure of themselves. So does this live up to the social approach that Alessandra promised us? The one which is sensitive to structural oppression? And sort of the short answer here is that I think it does, but I think it could be made even stronger and it could do this even better. So to me, the proposals that Alessandra puts forward, at least when you just think about the slogans, they're quite surprising to me, and they're almost the opposite of what I think of when I think about responding to oppression. So to me, tackling vices at the structural level can't just be about getting the measure of oneself and taking responsibility. I think it's got to be about getting the measure of the world as well. It's got to involve understanding oppression and its effects on you and others, and about recognizing the limits of your responsibility and of others' responsibility. And this is all stuff that Alessandra talks about in the book. So, you know, us as people who've read the book, we have an understanding of this. But as far as I can tell, it's not part of the educational proposal for reducing vices in others. And I think that this would be a good thing to do. And it might be that this is just me showing that I'm not a virtue epistemologist and I don't know what I'm talking about. That's very possible. But there are two reasons why this seems like a good thing to me. So the first one is just that it seems like this would be a better way to have an accurate view of the world. And I would have thought that having a good epistemic character is going to in some way connect up with having an accurate view of the world, or it should do. And secondly, I think this approach would help to reduce some of the defensiveness that's been talked about a couple of times today as well. So yes, telling somebody that they're timid or they're arrogant might make them more so if they think it's an inherent part of their character. But if it's explained in the context of, look, we're all affected by this structural stuff, which isn't our fault or isn't completely our fault, it strikes me that this would make them less defensive and make them more motivated to change. And so it could help with some of those worries that Aidan raised and the difficulties that Alessandra is trying to tackle in the book. So whilst I think that education is a good strategy for tackling problems on a structural level, and I see the value of Alessandra's specific proposal of self-affirmation, and I want to try it on myself and see if I can reduce some of my own intellectual vices, it's very noticeable to me that the understanding of oppression doesn't seem to be part of the education that's being proposed. And so it strikes me as falling a little short of a fully structural social approach. So I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of questions for Alessandra. So first of all, is there room for teaching people about oppression and its effects in this on this picture? Do you think those two things are compatible, or is this going to be counterproductive as well? And then secondly, can we afford to leave this out? So do you think it is possible to get the measure of yourself without understanding how oppression affects you and without understanding the limits of your responsibility? So can you get the measure of yourself without also having the measure of the world? So yeah, those are my thoughts. Thank you again. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing, or I'm looking forward to having the roundtable discussion with everybody.
Thank you very much for those comments, Natalie. We're going to give Alessandra a chance to respond to everyone, and then there will be a chance to ask some follow-up questions. Alessandra, is there anything in particular that you wanted to respond to directly, or were you hoping to then like have kind of a more back and forth? I know that you wanted more of a discussion than just a Q&A.
If people want, I can say a couple of things, and then. So I want to thank you. First of all, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I know fantastic is an overused word because Heather started and then everybody has to keep up with the level of energy. So everything is awesome, fantastic, and so on and so forth. But really, I genuinely appreciate it. It's been so interesting. So I'd like to, so apologies for not covering everything. I'd just like to make a couple of points. So to the first point by Heather, so your view is that it is possible that oppression or bad environments damage one's evaluative abilities without affecting one's motivation. Now, to some extent, I think that's conceptually true, but it's part of my empirical view that all cognition is motivated, right? And so I think I would be inclined to say that although what you're saying is possible at the conceptual level, at the psychological level, given what we know about if the theories that all cognition is motivated in one way or the other are correct, then I don't think that what you claim is psychologically realistic. The second point I'd like to make is about the fools and the other person, right? There is oppressed, right? So, and I think this brings in some of the things that also Mona said, right? I mean, both you and Mona are externalists, and I am an internalist. There is no doubt about this, right? But the reason why I am an internalist, not so much about, you know, warrant, right? But about vice. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I want to be ameliorative. I don't want to tie too closely notions of epistemic virtue and vices to epistemic goods, to the having of epistemic goods like knowledge and warrant, right? One of the reasons why I'm an internalist is because I think vice has to be a special kind of shortcoming, one for which the person is either blameworthy or criticizable in some way, and has to be so in a way that is not just what I say in the chapter on responsibility, attributable responsible. It can't just be something that is a feature of them, so that they can be presented to a third party as not being a good example to follow. But it has to be the sort of thing for which they, you know, somehow can be thought as accountable. And I think that notion of accountability requires some kind of internalism. So that's my motivation, which I suppose is more sort of motivation coming from the ethics of vice than the epistemology of vice. I think is in the nature of vice to have this aspect, right, of accountability. And I think if you are an externalist about vice, you can't easily explain that. So I think both Mona and Heather basically make it a contextual matter whether one has a vice or not. So you could have, right, exactly the same psychology, essentially, and be vicious in one environment, right, and or virtuous in another one. I think that is incompatible with the notion of responsibility, accountability, responsibility, and that's why I'm not a virtue or vice contextualist. I want to only make very quickly two claims about the other stuff that Mona said. So about the consequence independence, I just agree. I think that I work with the notion of vice, that where intellectual vices are a variety of moral vices. So I'm very happy to accept your point about independence. I do not think, though, that the claim about the truth independence is quite correct. And or at least it's not, I probably haven't expressed myself well in the book, but my view is not that the belief that results from the attitude would be based on no evidence whatsoever. My view is that the motivation that is part of the attitude selects both what evidence is considered and then the threshold that has to be reached for the evidence to be sufficient to lead the person to form the belief, right? So the view there would be that if you have a defensive attitude, you will tend to only consider a narrow band of evidence, only evidence that speaks to your defensiveness. And then there will be an asymmetry of errors, so that you will tend to need less evidence to form the belief that something is a threat than not a threat. So it's not my view that the person forms the belief without any evidence, is that the attitude skews or biases how the evidence is considered. So I think that might answer the math example, but perhaps not. But I just wanted to say that, you know, evidence plays a role. In response to Aidan, I'd just like to thank you so much. I'd just like to say two things. One is about the first point. I do think that self-affirmation doesn't just erode defensiveness, but makes you focus on values that perhaps are not, that you hold, but that perhaps are not prominent in, you know, in your thinking. And I think by doing that at the same time as eroding defensiveness might make you more open to seeing other people as a known threat, and therefore to be open to learn, right? So the view is not that the self-affirmation alone does all the work, but that it puts you in a position where you're more open to hear positive messages of a different kind. So that's how it's meant to, but I agree with the second point, which is that it could very well be the case that exemplarism is you know, sufficient for very young children who haven't got vices yet, right? I mean, my focus here was on the hard to reach, so to speak, but that doesn't mean that, you know, in all cohorts there will be some hard to reach. And finally, I just want to say, make a point to Natalie, which is, you're just right. I totally agree. You know, it is a limitation of the mismeasure of the self that, and I have a very lame reason, which is I had a word count and I couldn't, but you are absolutely right that it's, you know, if given everything else I say in the book, a whole range of non-agent centric interventions of that sort are important. So it's important to, you know, teach children about politics and the nature of oppression, undoubtedly. And, you know, because I say that the vices of inferiority have social causes, I mean, it is deeply important, I think, for instance, young girls who find themselves, you know, lacking in confidence, to part of what it is to acquire confidence, to learn that it's not just them, right? But that the way they feel is widely shared, and there are social reasons why it's distributed in that gendered fashion, right? And so I completely agree that has to be part of the story. Thank you so much.
Thank you for those responses, Alessandra. Now we're going to have time for people to ask follow-up questions. If you want to use the raise hand function along the bottom of your screen there, the raise hand function will just kind of indicate to me like when each hand was raised, and so then I can call on people accordingly. So yeah, if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand and get started. Yes, Mona.
Yeah, thanks so much. I have 600 questions, so I'm going to start with the first 280. So I'm wondering, Alessandra, about the maths case, just very briefly. not sure that the motivated evidence selection is going to get you out of it. The way in which I saw the case is that you're so good at maths that you only have evidence that suggests that you're good at maths. So even if you're trying to select them in a biased way, it doesn't really matter because you're selecting from an evidential basis that's uniform. You're just very good at maths. That's how it goes with me. At any rate, I'm kidding. I'm really very rubbish at maths. But so that's just a comment aside. But what I was wondering more is about your motivation for internalism, the motivation that you mentioned, which is that you like responsibility for vice, and you think that responsibility is incompatible with environmental dependence. So I think that responsibility implies some sort of environmental dependence in that it is dependent on etiology of seemings. So let me explain what I mean by that. So you're thinking, well, if it seems to me that I'm doing all right, I'm not to blame for failing, whatever the failure at stake is and whatever doing all right is about, right? So that's at least that was part of your debate with Heather, right? Where Heather was like, well, what if it you have all this horrible person, but it seems to them that they're doing well or whatever, right? So you are saying, well, look, I'm after a notion that implies responsibility. So insofar, it doesn't seem to me that I'm to blame if this is just how my seemings go, right? So from where I stand, that's all I can see, as it were. So I'm a bit of a brain in a vat, like that. But what the literature on the brain in a vat teaches us is that in the case of the brain, is not just the seemings that are doing the normatively positive work, but it's also their etiology. Because consider a counterpart of the brain where the brain, where it's not a brain, it's just me, and I'm a bit biased cognizer. It seems to me that all women are stupid because I'm a sexist, and it seems to me that all Black people are thieves and angry because I'm a racist. And it just seems to be like that. There's nothing I can do to fight it. It's, these biases, we know they're very strong. There's nothing I can do about it. As soon as a woman says something just seems absolutely stupid to me. And from where I stand, that's how it looks like. And intuitively, we want to say that the sexist and the racist and so on are not equally justified to the brain of that. And people have tried to explain this, of course, in a million ways. But the important bit is that it does seem to have to do with the etiology of the seemings, right? That the good seemings are seemings sourced in the right fashion, in the case of the brain, right? While the bad seemings are sourced in dubious sources like wishful thinking or biases and so on. But of course, etiology is an externalist notion. So I worry that actually that you can't want an internalist because you want responsibility to be sensitive to the etiology of these seemings. You don't want, basically, I think it's unfair to your virtuous person if they end up being in the same pot with the sexist in virtue of having the seemings, as it were. And I'm wondering how to think about it.
Can I start with the math though, because I'm not convinced, right? So suppose that the person is is very arrogant or whatever, right? But also very good at math, right? And your example is, so this person, thinks they're very good at math. Their belief is based on their arrogance, but they go out, they solve the stuff, and that gets them evidence that they are good at math, and now their belief they're good at math is based on evidence, right? Well, but I mean, what I want to say is that mostly of those cases, this person who is arrogant and good at math, but realistic person, right? So somebody who's not God, and therefore for any math problem, no matter what it is, they would solve it, right? Then it is at least arguable that first this person will reach the belief that they are good at math on the basis of having succeeded fewer times than necessary to form that belief. It's also plausible that this person we'll try math examples that are, reasonably easy to achieve, where that person to fail occasionally, they would sort of say, oh yeah, I was tired today. It was out of character, right? So what I say is, I think that if, that there is still a pattern of using the evidence in a certain way, or, going a way of going out and seeking evidence that is still, I think, representative of a sort of biased investigative behavior. So that's my inclination. Do you want to respond to that? And then I go back to the Simion's bit.
Can I, if that's okay? I can also wait. So yeah, I mean, so let me get this straight. So what you want to say is that in plausible normal circumstances, we're not talking about Einstein, there's going to be a disparity between how good at maths I think I am and how good at maths I actually am. Right. So basically, my evidence is going to suggest a different maths potential than my self-admiration does.
Not quite. I'm saying that you will seek the evidence. You'll put yourself in a position where you'll get positive evidence and avoid situations where you are at risk of getting counter evidence. So you will only do things that are likely to. So it's similar to the real example of self-sabotage, right? So we know that people self-sabotage, where self-sabotage consists in, if you have a total but not even conscious suspicion that you might fail at a task, do not practice. So that once you fail, that failure is no evidence of lack of ability, is only evidence of lack of application. Which is why at Oxford, a third is better than a 2-1, right? Because no one can tell from a third whether you're any good, right? You might just have had a good time.
Yeah, I mean, my one thing to say is that all of that you say suggests that there is a mismatch between, the evidence that I have and the belief that I have, right? Because there's going to be a mismatch in one way or another. Either I believe that I can solve mathematics to a degree of difficulty of 0.8, and my evidence only suggests that I can solve mathematics to a degree of difficulty of 0.5 because I search only easy ways, easy problems or whatever. So there's a mismatch there. Or there is no mismatch. I believe that I can solve 0.8 difficulty, and I actually go ahead and solve 0.8 difficulty. And I guess my claim is if there is no mismatch, so if I try really hard to find easy mathematics but fail, so I eventually end up having 0.8 difficulty evidence with 0.8 difficulty capacity beliefs, then there is no mismatch. So then I end up with a fully justified belief. Or if there is a mismatch, so if I search only easy problems and the result is that the evidence suggests only 0.5 mathematical capacity while my belief is 0.8 mathematical capacity based on my self-admiration, then there is lack of accuracy. And the claim that we were discussing was whether vice is compatible with accuracy. And I was claiming that there needs to be a lack of accuracy for vice to survive. And the case seems to suggest that either there is lack of accuracy and vice, or there is no lack of accuracy, but in that case, it's less plausible that there's vice. So to me, it just is very hard to build a case in which, as a matter of fact, your belief about yourself is fully accurate, and you go ahead in the world and you engage in that activity, and it remains accurate in the light of the evidence that you get as a result of that, but you remain, and at the same time you remain vicious. See what I mean? That's
I do. We'll have. I mean, I think it depends on what you think of normative defeaters, but I think it is possible, right? That you basically have a belief that, from your viewpoint is, it's based on all the evidence you have, but there are normative defeaters that you should have, but you don't, because your bias leads you to ignore them. So that's the kind of situation that you could have, I think. So that's what I want to say. Can I talk about the seemings? I'm not sure I fully followed. So I might be wrong. I might want to ask you another time what do you think? But it seems to me, right, that I agree that etiology matters, but etiology need not be outside the skull. Or, well, actually, I don't want to be an internalist about mental content. It does not have to be. It does not have to be an outside the mind etiology, right? So for me, etiology matters, but what matters is sort of the cognitive process that caused the seeming, right? So it's not just the seeming itself, it's etiology, but its etiology is not an etiology in terms of the perceptual input, is an etiology in terms of the cognitive processes that that shaped the way in which you take in the input. So yeah, so that's all I have to say.
Yeah, so if you go that way with an externalism about mental content, you're still an externalist though, right? So you're now, whether I'm blameworthy or not, still depends on the world, because my mental content depends on the world. Right?
In that sense, your content of your beliefs, yes.
Yeah, but if that's the case, my question is, I guess my curiosity is, since you need to draw the line between blameless and blameworthy in the environment anyway, because you're an externalist about mental content, why not draw it in the environment a bit more to the right rather than a bit more to the left?
Look, I don't know. I see what you're saying. I suppose because I have this view where accountability, responsibility has sort of hinges on motivation, right? Hinges on this idea, right? So a person is accountable, responsible for things that show either a concern or a lack of concern, right? And where that concern is a matter of motivation. I suppose because I'm driven by that, but I can see that that's not necessarily a good idea. It's a prior.
Alexander Bird, I think I have an exchange with Alexander Bird that I'm going to send that I think is interesting. Alexander wants to do the same thing. And he wants to say, well, it makes sense to do this because then you're laying responsibility at the door of the believer where it should be. And my reply to him is, no, you're not, because insofar as you're still drawing the line in the environment because of externalism about mental contact, it's still not at the door of the believer proper, because the door of the believer is in the believer's head, not outside, as it were. You know, as soon as you go outside, the poor believer is still not going to be in full control of what they're doing.
Oh yeah, my view though is not about control; it's about it's about motivation. So, but. Yes, but it's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I am aware that I come to it because of this commitment about responsibility, which then drives the other things. Whereas you come to it with a different kind of commitment, which then drives you to have different views about everything that follows from it. So I agree.
It looks like Heather has a raised hand.
Yes, thank you. Let me just remember to lower my hand. Yeah, thank you so much. And this is a really cool dialogue here. So thank you, Mona and Alessandra. So this question about what it takes to have accountability, responsibility is so important, I think, for what it can tell us about virtue and vice. And I wanted to ask about how it's connected to one of the points that Natalie raised. And so one of the ways in which it's going to connect the kinds of things that Mona and I are focusing on with the kinds of things that Natalie and Aidan are focusing on, right? So one of the points Natalie raised is about taking responsibility. And Alessandra Alessandra does in the latter parts of the book make suggestions about, sort of initial suggestions about what we can, pieces of, sort of plan for trying to rehabilitate vices and make progress, right? And one of those involves self-affirmation, which Aidan and Natalie also talked about, but the other piece, or a related piece, involves taking responsibility. And I'm wondering, because it seems to me, and here Alessandra is drawing on Claudia Card's forward-looking notions of responsibility, right? So it seems to me that in these cases, we could be taking responsibility for sexism, racism, all kinds of implicit biases, when these are, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm tempted to say, Alessandra, you may disagree. I'm tempted to say we can be taking responsibility for those even when, or maybe even more importantly, because we're motivated to get the truth. And so because we care about truth and we want knowledge and understanding, and we recognize that we have found ourselves in an oppressive environment due to bad luck, and we thus have, at the very least, implicit biases, and in many cases, explicit ones, we can, it seems to me that when we're in that situation and we care about truth, we can take responsibility for those implicit biases. But when we're doing that, I mean, is that accountability responsibility? Is the taking responsibility some other kind of responsibility from the accountability? How does the responsibility, is the accountability responsibility, is that just about how we come to have the virtues and vices to begin with? Or is that also forward-looking? How are those things connected, if they are? Does that make sense? I'm not formulating this very well.
It does. So there is an aspect of that chapter that perhaps I didn't really sufficiently emphasize in the book. So what I'm trying to do there is not start with the metaphysics and try to figure out responsibility, but start with responsibility practices, right? The practice of taking out people to be responsible, and the practice of taking oneself to be responsible. So when I call about attributability, answerability, and accountability responsibilities, I think those are three facets of our practice of taking people responsible. And they are manifested in different sorts of reactive attitudes that we take toward people, right? So I think that vice talk functions in two different kind of practices. There is the practice where you're talking to the person and calling them vicious, right? And then there is the practice where you are exhibiting or pointing to a person, having as your addressee another one, right? So I think attributability, so we use attributability responsibility in that second case, right? So take your example, I always forget his name, that you got from the ethics literature, of the person who did horrible things but had a horrible history. And so, you know, you might—
Robert Harris, yeah.
Yeah. So you might think that they are not really, you know, that their personality has been so warped, right? that in many ways that they are not even, they're not answerable for what they do because, their judgment is so impaired. They might have developed pathologies that means that they are not able to really feel empathy for other people. So in that sense, they are not really anymore accountable. But you might still want to present them as the example of a person that you wouldn't want to, recommend other people follow, right? So you might still, and that just is still a way of bringing them in your practices of responsibility by saying this person is a bad person, right? And so that is the kind of attributability responsibility in my view, right? And then answerability responsibility is when somebody does something bad but is out of character, right? And so they are kind of answerable for that. And then accountability, in my view, is the sort of thing that shows, ill will. But, or at least that we take to show ill will. But my start is the reactions, right? And so there are practices of taking people to be responsible that involve reacting to them emotionally in a variety of ways, discussing in a variety of ways. And then there is a different practice, which is the practice of taking ourselves to be responsible, which I think is exhibited in a variety, right, of attitudes, but also just behaviors, right? So I want to say that, the starting point is two different practices. One that is self-directed and the other that is complex and other directed. So that's how I think of those, right? And then the connection with the earlier stuff about internalism, or if you want, whether virtues and vices are context dependent in that way, is whether that notion of context dependent virtue is at home with our actual practices of holding people responsible or not. Now, one view one could take, which is not the view I take, but I have no argument against it, is that our practice is just in error, right? One could say, yes, we do these things, right? This is how we get angry at people. This is how we blame them. This is how, but we really shouldn't do this, right? Our ordinary practice, it's just wrong, right? Because in reality, this is what virtues and vices are like, and therefore what we should do is modify our responsibility practices. I don't give an argument why our responsibility practices are not out of kilter, because I do this Straussonian thing of presuming, that they are fine, and then try to see what follows about virtues and vices from that. Although I do so in a back to front way, because the responsibility stuff is at the back of the book.
Yeah, so just to really, and the connections to normative contextualism and why you're rejecting it, I think, are fascinating. That is super interesting. But just really quick follow-up to make sure I'm understanding. So we can take responsibility for qualities, just broadly construed, that we might have, for some qualities that we might have for which we are not accountable. That's correct on your view, right? We can take responsibility for some qualities we might have for which we're not accountable.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay.
But also, in my view, we might be accountable for certain things, but other people do not have the standing to
Yes.
right.
Yes.
Right. And I think this is true almost always of the vices of inferiority, right?
Yeah.
People are accountable for, but almost never is it right for people to hold them responsible for them. because of the circumstances in which those vices have been developed, and because people don't have the right kind of standing.
Yeah, so that is fascinating, and that is a place where you and I differ too, I think, because I would want to say that we aren't accountable for vices like servility or self-abasement, or in the case of arrogance developing as a result of systematic credibility excess, right? That we wouldn't be accountable for arrogance either. Yeah. All right. Fascinating. Yeah. Really good.
So I'm right. So I think a lot of these vices in the day to day, when it comes to sexism and racism, it often, I think people are trapped by certain social structures and caught in certain vicious circles from a very early age, and so I suppose I have this view that people are accountable, right? But because they demonstrate this lack of sensitivity, right? So I think one of the way racism manifests itself, right, is in a kind of insensitivity where you don't even notice, right? You genuinely do not notice things because you don't look in the right places where, right? And you do so, out of a lack of interest, right? A lack of concern. And I think you are accountable for those. But I also would be very surprised if there were many white people who were in a position not to come across as hypocrites by saying that, right? Which is not to say that we shouldn't all take responsibility for it. So that's the thought.
Yeah.
I don't currently see any more hands raised. Does anyone else have a question?
I just wanted to give a quick shout out. We didn't talk about this today, but I just wanted to say I think Alessandra's distinctions between servility and self-abasement are really important, and she's doing fantastic work there. And that it's what she does there is she draws a distinction based on the erosion of double consciousness. So she thinks that servility involves being able to maintain a double consciousness of the kind that W.E.B. Du Bois is talking about, but that in this self-abasing person, the double consciousness erodes. And I think that's a really important and helpful way to be thinking about the vices of inferiority. Yeah. So I think it can result in some issues about reliability and unreliability again, but I think overall it's a really important focus of her book, which we haven't spent a lot of time on today. So I just wanted to give a shout out for that part of the book.
Absolutely. And we have time for one more question from Mona.
It's related to what we were talking about earlier. So I was wondering again about this narcissism and superbia, my favorite things in the book. I was wondering if it shouldn't actually be the case that they can be manifest in spite of known accuracy. You see what I mean? So I'm wondering if there shouldn't be a way to spell them out such that even though you're very good at it, you're still a narcissist. And that such that you're absolutely accurate. So there's absolutely no mismatch between you and the world. You're not, so looking for evidence in a skewed way. You're, genuinely, so, you're narcissistic, but kind of honest. So you love yourself really badly, and you're not trying to avoid evidence against your self-admiration. So you're not, choosing your evidence in a skewed way. You're totally open. And that's because that's how it went for you, right? So narcissistic as you were, you always were very accurate in your narcissism. So you're kind of relaxed, you don't need to bother to kind of choose evidence, to cherry pick them, as it were. But it should be the case that, I mean, at least if we understand narcissism in the kind of following the narcissist story kind of way, it should be the case. I agree with you that however we spell it out, it is compatible with knowledge of skill, even of exceptional skill, and even with full accuracy and not cherry picking evidence. And I was wondering if you agreed with that or not. So in a very extreme case, take the case of God. God is super smart, but kind of loves themselves too much. And in particular, if you want to say that intellectual virtues are kind of a species of moral virtues in your case, it would seem as though this should kind of work. It should be the case that God can be vicious.
I would not want to pass judgment on whether God can be vicious. I have no idea. But I suppose actually what this question raises is an issue of how we are using this term narcissism, right? So I am trying to do a balance between doing a sort of philosophical analysis based on philosophical traditions of what we mean by narcissism, and our intuitions, if you want, of how the term ought to be used, together with the empirical literature that's right, that talks about this phenomena in a way that, I mean, one of the things that I try to do in that bit of the book is actually criticize on the basis of using philosophy, psychological accounts of narcissism, because in my view, they are an absolute mess. Partly because the instrument they use to measure narcissism, the narcissistic personality inventory, it is absolutely a mess. Although it's valid, I think it actually does not capture one thing, it captures numerous things, which tend to come together. And so that's why you get validity. So this is a long way of saying, I just think that once you start considering the sort of things that you want me to consider, Mona, I just lose complete track of the empirical reality. And then I don't know, because of what I'm trying to do, which is to talk about character vices, which are meant to be psychologically real and not just sort of conceptually possible, but actually, certainly not contradicting the existing evidence and finding some sort of empirical support, then I don't know what to say, you know what I mean? Then I'm just relying on my philosophical intuitions, which are not right, but this is not to be meant to be, a matter of just what is conceptually possible. It's be a matter to be what, given the way human beings are like on the whole, how does this usually manifest itself? Because one of the things that the book is trying to do, I think, is to do non-ideal epistemology, right? So it's trying to sort of really still be normative, but be informed by the limitations of, human psychology and the advantages of human psychology, but just by the nature of it. So that's what I would say to that.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, my example was actually not God, but many of our, white male senior colleagues in the profession. I'm not going to start naming the ones that I'm thinking about in particular, but there's many out there that we can all think about who I think will display these two properties that I mentioned, whereby we would think of them, we would be firmly convinced that they have, confirmation at every step that they're very smart, because they're very smart. So there's just going to be, suffocating them, the evidence that they're very smart. And at the same time, we tend to think of them as being a bit exaggerated on the self-admiration front. So this would seem to suggest that maybe there's just an indecent amount of self-admiration that's indecent independently of how successful you actually are, which I would have called narcissist. But as you well put it, maybe it's just we don't really understand what this notion is, and we have to kind of stipulate this definition in order to know what we're working with to begin with.
Yeah. Can I quip? They are not as smart as they think they are.
Yes, they are.
One. But the other quip, which I think is less of a quip, I think the very idea of smartness in philosophy is the problem. And so one of the ways in which I think these vices of superiority and inferiority come in is also the way of evaluating what kind of features, right, are features that are worth having, right? So what sort of the idea here is that arrogance, right, is in partly about evaluating features of yourself in order to perpetuate a sense of, self-worth and superiority. Smartness is ideal for that because nothing will ever count really as evidence either for or against it, right? Not fully, right? Because smartness is so vague, right? It's meant to be an holistic assessment, right? So somebody who is dumb, it can be very, precisely because they are dumb, they are rather smart, right? So Heather knows this and the person will remain unknown. But, right, we always took the fact that he thought that somebody has stolen the hole in his keyhole as evidence, not that he was an idiot, but that he was, yes, eccentric, but very smart, right? This is our ex-teacher, Jose Bernadette, right? So smartness works that way, right? You first have the features of the person, a certain kind of white eccentric male, and then whatever they do, that counts as smart, right? So that is, right? So that's the kind of, right, way in which I think this sort of biased, right, self-assessment work.
All right, well, I want to take the opportunity to thank all of our commentators. Thank you for preparing your comments. Thank you for all the wonderful insights. And I want to thank most of all Alessandra for writing the wonderful book that had the occasion to bring us together. So thank you so much, everyone.